We're thrilled to welcome you to today's webinar. By Understanding Reconstruction, You Understand the United States, presented by the ABA Section of Civil Rights and Social Justice and the ABA Center for Human Rights. This is the fourth program in a series exploring the Reconstruction era, 1865 to 1877, and its enduring influence on civil rights, justice, and equality in the United States. Please stay tuned for more details on upcoming events in this series. The section is also developing additional programming on a range of pressing issues. Please visit americanbar.org/CRSJ for updates. We also encourage you to submit questions for our panelists today through the Q&A function, not the chat. If you don't see the controls, please ensure that your screen is active. We will monitor the Q&A and do our best to address as many questions as time allows. A recording will be shared with all registrants, so please feel free to circulate it within your networks. My name is Etienne Toussaint, and I will be your moderator for today's discussion, which explores why learning about Reconstruction is essential for all lawyers and for anyone who is invested in the future of democracy in this country. Our conversation is especially timely. Today, we seem to be living through a period that echoes the post-Reconstruction era, when American politicians, judges, and elites systematically dismantled the civil rights and racial justice gains of that time. Over the years, Reconstruction has too often been characterized as a failure, defined by incompetence and corruption, rather than recognized for its revolutionary achievements. As a result, this critical chapter in American history has often been overlooked in our legal education and public discourse for more than a century. To help us unpack the significance of this moment and its ongoing relevance, we're honored today to be joined by two distinguished panelists. First, we have Daryl Atkinson, co-founder and director at Forward Justice. And secondly, we have Barrett Holmes Pitner, philosopher, journalist, educator, and author of the book, The Crime Without a Name, Ethnocide and the Erasure of Culture in America. Our goal today is not only to deepen collective understanding of Reconstruction, but to consider how this knowledge might help us reconstruct the United States in more just and inclusive ways. All right, we're going to begin with some questions for our speakers, and we will follow up with a Q&A with the audience. So to begin, I want to turn to you, Daryl. I understand that your organization has drawn on the legal scholarship of an often overlooked figure from the Reconstruction era. And this is in your work on restoring voting rights to people with felony convictions. Can you tell us a little bit more about that scholarship and how the legacy of Reconstruction has shaped your legal advocacy today?
Yeah, no, thank you for the question, Etienne. Thank the ABA Civil Rights Social Justice section for having me. I guess where I would pivot slightly is that our initial scholarship was around the 1868 Constitution in North Carolina, our Reconstruction Constitution, if you will. Through my, continued interest, and, I'm a subscriber to the Reconstructionists, I learned more about this figure, Tourget, Abion Tourget, who was a white lawyer out of Greensboro, who was a seminal figure in the construction of that 1868 Constitution. I prepared a couple of slides to help tell this story. I hope it's okay if I transition quickly. So when we began thinking about how we do our work at Forward Justice, we operate from a movement lawyering principle. We believe three intersecting theories of change are relevant. One, transformational change is driven by social movements. Some of those social movements, our most potent ones, have been located in the South, and social movements are led by people who are most directly impacted by the problem that they're trying to solve. I didn't one day wake up and decide I wanted to be a civil rights attorney and a community organizer on behalf of people with criminal records. My life circumstances propelled me in that direction. In 1996, I was convicted of a first-time nonviolent drug crime and given 10 years in prison. I went into prison with a high school diploma, came out with a high school diploma. Fortunate enough for me, I had a loving family that could provide me food, clothing, and shelter. And I went back and I got my associate's degree, bachelor's degree, law degree. I'm licensed to practice law in both Minnesota and North Carolina. Worked in the Obama administration, and my seminal practice area, exclusive practice areas on the restoration of the civil and human rights of people who've been to prison and jail. So when we begin a question about a campaign, we say, who are our people and what is their problem, right? And in North Carolina, we've been able to build a second chance alliance that's a statewide network of people who've been convicted of who have criminal records, them and their family members. And we've been advocating for change since 2011. One of their issues was their ability to vote. And so I'm going to tell you the story of the Unlock the Vote campaign, which has this buried nugget of how we use the 1868 Constitution to advance voting rights in the present day for people with criminal records. So the problem was people under felony supervision denied a civic voice. We wanted to end felony disenfranchisement. That denial of civic voice resulted in political and social exclusion. 56,000 taxpaying citizens who dropping kids off every day, doing all of the things that me and you and Barrett do, but they're denied a civic voice. One of our individual plaintiffs, Shamika, was a mother of four during the COVID pandemic, and she wanted to be able to vote for who was going to be on the school board, and she couldn't, and that's why she got involved. So our goal was to end community-based felony disenfranchisement. We launched this Unlock the Vote campaign. And it wasn't just a campaign for legal change, because the way that we think about our work, we want to attack the three faces of power. We have to change law, policy, and practice in a way that builds power for our people. We have to change the narrative, the culture, the values that we associate with these particular issues. And we had to organize as many directly impacted people as possible to affect change. So we filed this lawsuit, Community Success Initiative v. Moore, in 2019. We had 5 organizational plaintiffs and 6 individual plaintiffs. 4 major claims: that 13-1 and that's the statute that governs people getting off felony supervision, that it violated the Free Elections Clause, the Equal Protection Clause. But here's the constitutional amendment I want you to pay attention to: the ban on property qualifications. This is the constitutional amendment that Tourget was associated with in 1868. And no one had really litigated under what that ban actually meant. And what the ban was about: the 1790 Constitution, the prior Constitution, required, in order to vote for the Senate, you had to have 5 acres of land. Anybody could vote for the House. So when they had this seminal event called the Civil War, right, that was fought over slavery, all Southern states had to get readmitted back into the Union. That required adopting, equal protection, 14th Amendment kind of language. But some states went even further with their egalitarian kind of ideals, and North Carolina was one of them. And it put the ban on property qualifications because it didn't want poor people, poor white people, to be disenfranchised from their lack of owning property to be able to vote for both House and Senate. Motion for summary judgment for our non-legal folks here. This is a stage in the case where you can say, you know what, Your Honor, we got enough evidence right now for you to decide this case. And they did. In September 2020, a three-judge panel, we didn't just have to convince one judge, we had to convince three. And a vote 2-1 said that North Carolina's practice of having probationers pay off all of their fees, fines, and restitutions was a violation of Article 1, Section 10, ban on property qualifications. We made the argument that money is property, and therefore and we put in, our expert witness put in evidence that the average probationer owes $2,400, right? In fees, fines, and costs. So that means you have to own $2,400 of property to buy your voting rights back, right? Analogous to the 5 acres of land that Tourget and his comrades were attacking in the 1868 Constitution. We took our case to trial because we had some remaining claims under the Equal Protection Clause and the Free Election Clause. I figured you all would get a little, get a little, this is me making closing arguments. We aren't going to listen to that, but it was a little action reel, if you will, if you want to go back and check it out. But this is a timeline of what we were able to do. In 2022, after we won at trial, because we end up winning on all of our claims, our equal protection claims, our free election clause claims, and our ban on property qualifications claim. It resulted in the largest expansion of voting rights since 1965 in North Carolina. Over 56,000 people got their voting rights on July 27th, 2022. This was 101 days before the November midterms, and we had a sprint of 101 days to try to get as many people registered as we possibly could. My math may be off, but I remember that number. But we were able to register about 14,000 folks. About 7,000 folks voted who otherwise would not have had the ability to have a civic voice. But in the meantime, we all know what happens when you advance or you break open or you transform or you reconstruct, right? And add people who previously weren't part of the civic fabric to the civic fabric. It's always backlash. And so while we were litigating this case in court, we elect our Supreme Court in North Carolina, and there were 2 elections. In 2019, when I filed the case, it was 6-1 D's to R's. By the time in 2023 that I'm arguing before the North Carolina Supreme Court, it was 5-2 Republicans. They were able to recognize the advancements that we were making in the courts, and the regressives responded and started really politicizing and running Supreme Court candidates in a really aggressive partisan way. And they were able to take back the courts. And in 2023, that resulted in the rogue court that we have now that is currently about to undo a duly elected Supreme Court justice once again. This is a picture of the lit that we sent out because we didn't want that win just to live in the courtroom. We sent this to everyone who was in the affected class, them and their family members, and other justice involved folks. I will stop share now and we can get back to the conversation, but that's an example of what I think of reconstruction in practice, right? Where we're actually trying to use some of the advancements that were part of that seminal period to make and transform opportunities for people today.
Thank you so much, Daryl, for sharing that. That was just incredibly powerful. And I think, as you just noted, it demonstrates the point perfectly that there are nuggets of insight buried in history that we don't know about, but that once unsurfaced, provide the answer to some of the problems that are facing us today. I want to turn to Barrett because I imagine, like me, many Americans have never heard of Albion Tourget Why do you think, as someone who's deeply steeped in the Reconstruction era as a scholar, philosopher, why do you think this work has been largely forgotten, and why is it important that we remember these contributions today?
Well, well, thank you for, asking that question and thanks for your work, Daryl. So like I think Albion Tourget has been forgotten because there's a clear agenda after Reconstruction to erase all of the accomplishments and to paint that era as a failure, that something that was blighted by corruption or incompetence by the formerly enslaved. And so, due to this stigma that's been attached to Reconstruction, all of these heroes have just been buried and erased from our like collective cultural consciousness. And as a result, there is just such a wealth of valuable knowledge that's residing in this really small window of 12 years that is often overlooked. And so Tourget is forgotten because a segment of our society wanted him to be erased. And that segment is manifesting in the same way that Daryl pointed out, that after they had their accomplishments by invoking Tourget's work, the court in North Carolina shifted, and now they're trying to undo all that stuff. It's the same process. This is the same cycle that happens over and over and over. And if you are an American that cares about equal protection under the law, multiracial democracy, there has to be an awareness that you can't let this era be erased and that we have to invoke the wisdom from it, remember the heroes, and use that in our practices as we campaign for the same progress, the same struggles that they were advocating for and fighting against in the 1860s and 70s, which clearly in the 1960s it was a continuation of that same struggle. The cycle repeats. And so like that's why it was forgotten. But I also want to point out that it's really fascinating that Daryl mentioned Albion Tourget because I also teach at George Washington University here in DC, and I've started like a small group of students who are passionate about Reconstruction. They're passionate about being Reconstructionists, and of the assignments that I give them, I'm always like, this thing happened in the present today. I know there's a parallel in Reconstruction. This is the parallel. Go research this and come back to me. And so they did that about a month ago on one topic, and one of these students found Albion Tourget. I hadn't even heard of him, but this undergrad found him and was like, "This guy is a hero. Like, I can't believe I don't know about this guy. He's incredible." And the thing that was so great is that the student that found him was is a Latino, and they're passionate about being Reconstructionists. And they look in this era, and when people think of Reconstruction, they often think about it as being something that's like almost exclusively African Americans doing something to empower the Black community. But what it really is multiracial democracy, and there's heroes that are white heroes and Black heroes. And Albion Tourget is a white American. And so for someone in like this time period, a student, an undergrad, to see Reconstruction as a source of inspiration, and then to look in that era and find a white American that is now a source of inspiration for championing for like equality and justice and multiracial democracy is pretty profound. And one thing to continue to highlight what Daryl was pointing out is Albion Tourget continued fighting for racial justice after Reconstruction. He he was the lead counsel on Plessy v. Ferguson. So he was fighting the whole time. And the thing that's really fascinating, and this shows how this flipping of the courts can change what the law means in America, is that during Reconstruction, there was this really important case called Railroad Company v. Brown. A black woman named Catherine Brown who worked at the Capitol. Her job was like she was like kind of custodial type services. She was taking a train from Virginia to DC, and this railroad company had a charter to transport people from Virginia to DC, and part of that charter mandated that you could have no distinction based on race. Like everyone that got on that train had to be treated equally. And so she went to get on this train, and she was told that she had entered a white car. And she was like, that's crazy. Like I have a ticket. Everyone has the same ticket. I'm getting on the train. And then the people who work for the train company beat her up. They assaulted her, threw her off the train, and then after they beat her up enough, they threw her on the car that they had designated the black car, and she went to Washington, D.C. Once she got to the Capitol, the Republican senators and congressmen who worked there learned about this rather quickly, and they launched an investigation, and then they encouraged Catherine Brown to sue the railroad company. She was found in the lawsuit, they agreed with her, and she was awarded, I think, like $1,500 in compensation. But the railroad company challenged that decision and took it all the way to the Supreme Court. And and in their argument, they were talking about how they had this policy of separate but equal. And the Supreme Court in, I believe it was 1868, just essentially laughed that concept out. Let me pull up the direct quote from the justice real quick. But the direct quote reads that one second, that it was said the da 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 that the railroad company's argument of separate equal was an quote ingenious attempt to evade a compliance with the obvious meaning of the requirement. And so they knew that this was just a ploy to create inequality while claiming equality. And so during Reconstruction, it was completely laughed out, and Catherine Brown won. Well, then once Reconstruction collapsed, and federal troops were removed, these regressives, redeemers, as they called themselves, kept that argument going for the next 20 years. And they didn't want to change their argument. They just wanted to change the people on the court. And so then Plessy v. Ferguson comes around and they have the exact same argument. And Tourget argued how that argument was ridiculous, just like it was during Reconstruction. But over those 20 years, the court decided to take a very narrow reading of the Reconstruction Amendments. They wanted to take a reading of it that removed the spirit, that removed the intent of what they accomplished. And if you look at it in this very narrow, essentially illegitimate concept, it all the meaning is gone. And now equality and inequality are the same. Tourget even coined the term colorblind interpretation of the law back then. And in Plessy, they argued that you couldn't be colorblind, that was just an absurd idea. So that's why separate but equal was fine, because you had to, incorporate color in how you did everything. And so I just think this is really significant because we have this white American who has helped create North Carolina's Constitution, and the things that he did back then can still be applied today to empower people. And he continued the fight all the way through Plessy v. Ferguson. And these are the type of people that, if we are championing equality and racial justice and a multiracial democracy, and where people have equal protection under the law, like these are the names and the people that need to be remembered. And so yeah, it's quite significant. And you know, but through Reconstruction and Reconstructionism, hopefully we remember more and more of these people.
Thank you so much for that, Barrett. And there are a couple of threads that are starting to come out that I really want to make sure we tease out. Later on in the conversation, I want to return to some of our conversation about the carceral system, which is so important right now with everything that we see happening under the Trump administration with respect to immigrant detention, the rule of law. I want to make sure at the end of this conversation, we reserve some time to come back and discuss that. It's very much connected to some of the work that Daryl is doing and some of the threats that are facing the criminal justice system more generally, right? There's even been some talk of shipping people who are incarcerated out to prisons outside of the country, right? And when we think about who's in prison, there's a much, much bigger threat that I think we're not discussing enough. But I want to linger for a moment on this thread that Barrett has begun to tease out, which is this kind of theory and practice, right? This methodology, this praxis that we're describing as Reconstructionism. and think a little bit about what that means. What does it mean that, Daryl, you see yourself as enacting that? Barrett, you see yourself as discussing that from a philosophical standpoint. And so let me first address the question to Daryl. We met about a year ago. We both were attending a conference in Las Vegas on a panel together. And Barrett and I, at the time, were beginning to develop the Reconstructionism Project here through the ABA. We had not yet shared it widely. And during this session at the conference, someone asked you, Daryl, if you considered yourself an abolitionist. And you replied, no, I am a Reconstructionist. And that moment has stayed with me. And later I mentioned it to Barrett, and he, noted that we were all in conversation with each other, with each other, and didn't even know. And so I want to point the question to you first. What does that mean that you identify as a Reconstructionist from a theoretical standpoint, from a methodological standpoint? What does it mean that you're adopting that mindset in your work as a lawyer, as a legal advocate?
Yeah, and I respect the all of the theoretical work that has, been done around abolition. But for me, it was more generative to center what I wanted to build rather than what I wanted to tear down. And because of, those three kind of intertwined theories of change, social movements create change, some of our most powerful social movements in the South, and those social movements being led by directly impacted people. In our study of that, Reconstruction was a seminal period for those three aligned kind of theories. You can see in our brand, that's the North Star. Our people had to have something to look towards, somewhere to go that would be better. And so when we look at that historically, Reconstruction is one of those periods. And for me, and for our organization, we've always felt, DuBose was prophetic in how much he detailed the richness of that period, how much came out of that period. It became very much a North Star for us to look towards. What are real examples that we can point to where we've really had a multiracial democracy? Because the country wasn't founded on that. So when are the moments when we've really, as DuBose would say, those brief moments in the sun, where we've really tried to practice this thing, right? Where this country lived up to its highest egalitarian values. And Reconstruction is one of those periods, particularly in North Carolina for us. We had a vibrant multiracial democracy both in Wilmington, in this 1868 Constitution that still has relevant amendments that, govern our state. And so Reconstruction for me became much a more generative, you know, animating theory than abolitionism.
Barrett, I want to pose the same question to you. What does it mean to be a Reconstructionist in today's America? Do you see tensions? Do you see synergies between Reconstructionism and abolitionism? Are there ways that the frameworks complement one another, challenge one another? Sort of, what is your vision from a theoretical standpoint, from a practical standpoint, of adopting this lens toward the work that you're doing?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I agree with everything that Daryl said. From like a philosophical standpoint, I kind of view America in like a with like a cycle where there's like an era that starts where it indoctrinates and like legalizes inequality and division, and right after that happens, there is a push to abolish that, to create a more equal, just society. And that was, in the 1800s, that was the abolitionist movement. And it makes a lot of sense to be an abolitionist if your key focus for you to progress is to abolish the thing that's in your way, that's preventing that equality. And so I think it makes a lot of sense to put a lot of intellectual energy and effort and activism into that. But there's eventually, if you are successful enough at that, that you get to that next stage where you then have the opportunity to reconstruct the society in a better way in the absence of that impediment. And this also requires a lot of mental energy. You have to have like a shared language. You have to have a philosophy. You have to have an agenda. And they had that in the 18 and during Reconstruction. They called it Reconstruction. They had politicians who were they're radical Republicans that were implementing this agenda of Reconstruction. And if you look at that era, you can see that it's quite iterative, where they said, we're going to have, this Emancipation Proclamation. Then there's the 13th Amendment, and people theorize that that would be enough. And then it's like, actually, that wasn't enough. We then have to start civil rights. Oh, Civil Rights Acts. We need to expand it even more. 14th Amendment. These states like North Carolina that want to get back into the Union, they have to ratify the 14th Amendment. They need to make new constitutions that adhere to this Reconstruction philosophy, this proactive vision, where we're not just focusing on abolishing slavery. We already did that. Now we're reconstructing that better place. This is a lot of mental energy, a lot of discussion. It requires a lot of people to come together and be able to talk collectively in this way. And so you have to have the language to do so. And so I think this is really, really important. And to go back to Tourget, that after Reconstruction was collapsed in 1877, the agenda to erase it from our collective memory was very, very successful. And I think in the current climate that we have, most people who are champions of civil rights and racial justice and multiracial democracy, their inspiration comes from the civil rights movement of the 1960s and 70s, which makes sense. But that movement was clearly about abolishing the impediments of Jim Crow so that we could then get to a stage where we can then reconstruct it into a better place. And so, like, one thing that I find really interesting is as a professor, a lot of my students now, their formative childhood was Obama as president. And so this idea of America as this diverse, equitable, uh, racially just place where there's trying to be like an expansiveness of equality, an expansiveness of justice, where we're expanding it to with the Affordable Care Act. There's Obergefell, all this stuff like that. That is their mindset of just like how America was. To me, that is just like the energy of Reconstruction, not like the articulated policy, not the shared language, but they just want to continue Reconstruction. Like that's what they want to do. And there's a complete absence of that language and that philosophy that we can articulate because so much of our energy is about abolishing the bad. Because we aren't thinking about that era of Reconstruction where they then started reconstructing after they succeeded in abolishing slavery. And so to me, I think it's a two-step process where you need to be aware of both of them. And if you only are aware of one of the two, then that's going to be a major impediment. Like if you're only a Reconstructionist and you don't think about abolition, then that's a problem. And if you're only an abolitionist, you don't think about Reconstruction, that's a problem. I think of a seminal figure to think about is just Frederick Douglass. Like most people think of him as an abolitionist, but once Reconstruction happened, he worked pretty diligently on implementing Reconstruction because the dynamics had shifted. He needed to put his mind in those different places. And I think that's kind of where we all need to be as people who are champions of, multiracial democracy, civil rights, and whatnot. And so I'm really glad that Daryl's here because his work, he puts this into practice. And so
I guess the other thing I would add to that, Barrett
mhm.
and Etienne, in law school, I felt very inadequate in not having an jurisprudential counterbalance to originalism. That's what Reconstructionism can be. And we desperately need it in our legal academia. Originalism, the Federalist Society, all of that in response to the advancement of the Warren Court. But the Warren Court did not have an animating jurisprudence that was driving its change. That's why I think, which made the advancements that they had vulnerable when you had another side that had an animating jurisprudential center, right? Originalism as is center to advance regression in the legal field. So for us, I think Reconstructionism can be that counterbalance, that intellectual counterbalance to originalism, because originalism is based on founding of inequality. Reconstructionism is based on founding of equality, when this country finally was trying to get it right and live up to its highest ideals.
100%. Let me just add something real quickly to that is, as the philosopher and not a lawyer, I have the same vision, and for that to work, I have to collaborate with lawyers like people at the ABA, especially Daryl, to like develop that scholarship, because that's where it needs to go. And to highlight Daryl's point, like the word equal didn't show up in the Constitution really until the 14th Amendment. They mentioned it regarding like, executive power and how to make an amendment, but with regards to how people are viewed under the law, it didn't exist until the 14th Amendment, and equal was showed up where people had equal protection under the law. And so that's clearly the beginning of equality and equality under the law in the United States. And I think we all are advocates for defending that. And if you are, then Reconstruction is your anchor. Like that is your origin.
I love this conversation. And I want to push us to go a little bit deeper. I absolutely agree. There's an absence of a response to the jurisprudential discourse that takes place around originalism and the historical record. And I think Reconstructionism provides an interesting and insightful way to think about the way that lawyers historically, from Tourget onwards, have responded, and to center that discourse. But I want to bring in one comment that was made from the Q&A that I think is really relevant and can help push us a little bit. And they reference Chief Justice Roger Taney's statement in his opinion in Dred Scott that, quote, "There are no rights of Black men that white men are obliged to respect," end quote. In that case, if we recall, and as we learned in law school, is the one that sustains white supremacy in the late 1850s, but then is overturned by the 13th and 14th Amendment. And in their comment, I won't read the full comment by the audience member for sake of time, but to summarize, they reference that in overturning that case via the 13th and 14th Amendment, what that is changing is the citizenship rights of Black Americans. Yet the quote from Chief Justice Roger Taney is speaking to something deeper that perhaps needs to be changed, right? Maybe gesturing toward a culture that exists outside of the formal law, kind of vernacular law that governs how people interact with one another. And that, I think, speaks to something that I found provocative on your website, Daryl. Your slogan for Forward Justice is "Change the South, change the nation," right? And so even though the 13th Amendment changed the South technically from a legal standpoint, we still see other efforts were needed during Reconstruction. Jim Crow, the rule of law continued to harm Black people in countless ways. So what do you mean when you say change the South, right? How does that reflect the legacy of Reconstruction, the aim of Reconstruction, and what does that mean for progress in our country today?
Yeah, we went to one of our seminal figures, DuBose, and I think he was prophetic. Change the South, change the nation. 1/3 of the votes from the Electoral College come from Southern states. The largest percentage of representation in Congress is from Southern states. 38 of the 50 fastest growing counties are in the Sun Belt. It's where the majority of Black people are. It's where the majority of Black people own the most land when we think about controlling our food and our self-determination. We win here. We win the country. And it's also the place that has some of the most intractable obstacles. In 2011, after Shelby v. County versus Alabama, that gutted Section 4 of the Voting Rights Act that required pre-clearance before you made any types of electoral changes for certain covered states and counties. We saw 11 out of the 13 southern states immediately pass regressive voting rights kind of legislation, right, to make it harder to have maximum feasible participation in a multiracial democracy. That's our theory of the case, that if we can get maximum feasible participation in a multiracial democracy, we could get to the beloved community. We have huge impediments. The criminal legal system is a huge impediment, and historically, it has always been a huge impediment when it came to advancement of marginalized folks. Think about post-Reconstruction, Black codes, convict leasing. Think about even though it wasn't a Reconstruction period, it was in response to Jim Crow. But the civil rights movement, immediately after the civil rights movement, you have a war on drugs, you have a war on insurgents, you have a war on crime instituted by Richard Nixon, right? So the left hand of the state is the benevolent arm. It's the arm where you give education, health care, things of that nature. The right hand of the state is the punitive arm. And that arm becomes much stronger and much wider when the regressives are in control and want to shrink the we and we the people. But the change the South, change the nation is what we deeply believe, that if we could win the South, we can win the country.
Yeah, I want to pose the same version of that question to Daryl, to Barrett, rather. Thinking about what were the goals of Reconstruction, do you think it went far enough? And again, I want to elevate some of the voices that I'm seeing in our comments that can push us even further. I mean, one of the challenges alongside race was gender. As we're walking into the Reconstruction era, the experiences of women are vastly different than the experiences of men during the 19th century, and it continues to be so moving beyond the Reconstruction era. And so I want to pose that question to you, Barrett. Do you think the Reconstruction era went far enough? What are some of the unfinished promises? And perhaps you could fold in some thoughts on the gender dimensions of this. I mean, we don't get voting rights for women until much later. Much of the focus during the Reconstruction era is trying to achieve some semblance of equality for Black men primarily. And so I'm curious what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah, no, those are some wonderful questions. So I would say to on the first one about continuing with Daryl's question about changing the South, changing the nation, I think it's really evident from the founding of this nation. There's always been a series of compromises between the North and the South that allowed the South to have like a disproportionate amount of power in shaping the trajectory of the nation. And at each compromise, the South encroached more and more and more. And those compromises, more often than not, were always disadvantageous to people of color. And there's a quote from a Georgia senator about the expansion of slavery and how slavery was essential for the expansion, and that's why they felt so threatened to the Civil War. That prior to the Civil War was that wasn't the North was going to abolish slavery, but they would prevent the expansion of it because due to chattel slavery and the growth of the slave population in these southern states, they knew that they needed to expand because at a certain point, the population would grow so big in these states that it become almost impossible to oppress all of those people every waking moment of their lives. Like when the population of enslaved people reaches about 50%, it's going to be very hard to continue that chattel slavery system. Therefore, slavery would need to expand into the territories. And so the compromise that was always happening was a compromise that was always going to encroach on democracy because slavery was going to be an ever expanding system because the population of enslaved people was going to grow because slave owners wanted it to happen. And so you have to tackle that core root problem. And so in doing so, you will change the entire nation. And Reconstruction is clearly focused on changing that root problem, and the ramifications of that impact the whole nation. And so when I think of Reconstruction, like first off, we're talking about a really small period of time. We're talking about 12 years, but really only like 8 very efficient, effective years. And throughout all those 12 years, there was levels of oppression, like Ku Klux Klan, all sorts of militias, terrorism was going. There are so many impediments to make it really effective. And so one thing that I think needs to be taken into consideration is if gender or another issue that we felt needed to be addressed wasn't addressed during that time, it wasn't because of a failing of Reconstruction. It was more so a failing that America wasn't willing to continue Reconstruction. They didn't give it the opportunity to organically expand how it was already expanding. The 13th Amendment, 14th Amendment, 15th Amendment, all of these are clear iterative expansions of expanding the rights. Like it's not like African Americans got voting rights at the beginning. It was ending slavery, citizenship, voting rights. There was a continuum. As they did that, they also had to create the Department of Justice to enforce that. They had to create the Department of Education to make sure African Americans could get educated. There's a Freedmen's Bureau, Freedmen's Bureau's Bank. Civil rights were created. So there are so many iterative things that I think a logical conclusion would be that if America continued with Reconstruction, voting rights for women would have happened sooner. And I don't think it's a coincidence that once voting women obtained voting rights, it was through the amendment process. It was through applying a reconstructionist type strategy. And that discussion started to happen once Black women were brought into the fold of the women's suffrage movement. Prior to that incorporation, women's suffrage was mostly white women trying to talk to their white male politicians and having them hope that those people would then agree to make some sort of pass a law or whatever. And that had never shown any traction in the history of American society. Once they adopted a Reconstructionist approach and brought in people of color into the fold and into the equation, and it became something that would clearly give voting rights to Black women and white women and all American women, then it was successful. So I think we should look at the enfranchisement of women in the 1900s, in the 20th century, as like a delayed continuation of Reconstruction and not something that is signaled as some sort of failing. It's more of pointing out an inadequacy of an American norm and emphasizing the importance of having a Reconstructionist approach to how we go about civil rights and equality. And that's why I'd also say if we look at Obama's presidency, I'd say the Affordable Care Act and Obergefell, those are also a continuation of Reconstruction where you're trying to provide equal services to all sorts of Americans, and that includes healthcare, just like during Reconstruction, that included education and the Justice Department, all sorts of things that aren't like a clear racial division. This is a continuum, an expansion.
I
So
love that.
Yeah,
And
I guess if I would add anything, Etienne, just really briefly,
Mhm.
the push and pull, the back and forth of, you know, regression, redemption, and, reconstruction. I think of just the swings that this country started from the very beginning. We started with a really small we in We the People. The fights have been trying to expand who that we is throughout the history of this country. Some people want a really, really small we. I think our we now, using reconstruction kind of logic, would be a very expansive we, right? Where citizenship would look very different, right? Where fundamental rights, our Bill of Rights would look very different in our new Reconstruction Constitution, right? So I appreciate the critiques because I think they're healthy. No period was perfect, right? And to Barrett's point, 12 years, you could make that logical conclusion, and they were facing obstacles every step of the way. So that would be my answer
let me
to. to the question.
Let me add one last thing to that is talk about the expansiveness of citizenship. If we look at the Obama administration, I'd also put DACA and the attempts for DAPA as a continuation of a Reconstructionist approach where we're redefining citizenship, what it means to be an American that's more inclusive, more equitable. Like that's a continuation of that. But another thing to highlight is just like linguistically, Daryl's using the term regressives, and this is the term that I use within like a Reconstructionist framework because the people that were combating against Reconstruction, the former Confederates who became Klansmen and also government officials, they called themselves redeemers because they wanted to redeem the South to make it how it was before, which sounds familiar to current rhetoric. And so once Reconstruction ended, the era that came after, they called it the era of redemption. And so we are now like told to call this era that regressed all the progress of Reconstruction as some sort of redeeming era. Like, I think that's just such a corrupted use of language where now, like, everything's become inverted. And you can see that with Plessy v. Ferguson, where the language of equality was applied to create inequality. And so now redemption is used to create regression. And so to be more accurate as to like what's happening, they are trying to regress society. And so instead of saying redeemers, it's regressors. And that's just more accurate so we don't facilitate this linguistic corruption.
So insightful. And I'll just, briefly note, I think it's really fascinating to think about Reconstructionism from a theoretical standpoint as a response to originalism. And I'm loving some of the thoughts that you all are teasing out. And I think this is going to be an ongoing conversation. Some of the things I've taken away from what you said thus far is viewing Reconstructionism as a methodology, which I think really gets to the question of what does it mean to interpret the meaning of the Constitution. Originalism pointing us to foundational principles, ideas that are inscribed on the page. Reconstructionism seems to be gesturing toward a methodology, a praxis, a moments of discourse, right? Moments of equal discourse where people have an opportunity to voice their lived experience. And I appreciate Barrett's, the perspectives that had Reconstruction continued, we would have seen more voices from women across the spectrum participating in that discourse. And to be sure, we don't have time to get into it here, but Barrett knows and others who study Reconstruction that even during that era, there were women who were voicing their viewpoints about citizenship, about voting, about democracy during the Reconstruction era. Certainly white women were vocal, but there were also some women of color, Harriet Tubman, for example, and others who were on the speech stump and talking about equality for women of color as well. And of course, it was the ending of that public discourse that sort of ended how we're describing what Reconstructionism, which I think accords very much with this notion of a living constitution idea, is. But I want to move on because I'm sensitive to our time, and I want to make sure we circle back to this important conversation that we started about our carceral system. Because Daryl Atkinson, that's really central to some of the work that you're doing. And it's very timely to what we see happening today, alongside book bans, alongside assaults on the universities, we are seeing increasingly punitive detention policies. We're seeing threats of sending people in American prisons overseas. We are seeing a double down on policing across the country in a variety of different ways. What should we take from this? And I'll, throw this out to both of you. Daryl, you can get started. What lessons from the Reconstruction era might help us respond to the changes that are happening in our so-called criminal justice system And what might it mean to reconstruct justice for people who are incarcerated and also for people who are returning to society from incarceration?
No, great question, Etienne. As I stated earlier in some of my introductory statements, whenever the regressives want to restrict the we want to expand the we in people. We are freedom with, not freedom from, right? We want to expand that we. Whenever they want to restrict it, the implementer of that regression ends up being police, prosecutors, prisons, right? In the domestic context. Now we're even seeing the increased efforts on the international context. But let's not even be asleep at the wheel that national domestic incarceration has gone up the last 2 years. When Obama came in office in 2007, incarceration was at its height at 2.3 million. From 2007 to 2022, a 15-year period, right? Incarceration was cut by a quarter. Black male incarceration was cut by a third. Black women's incarceration was cut by 74%. Community supervision was cut by 27%. Juvenile incarceration, kid jail was cut by 50%. We were able to make meaningful gains in solving that particular problem. Now we see this rise of take back the country, right? This rise of regression, and the carceral apparatus is being ramped up to squash and restrict the democratic aspirations of people in this country. And that's how it's being used. We're going to see local incarceration rates go up with state and local jails, as well as federal. And then we're going to see the international aspect where we're sending people to El Salvador and countries like that.
Can I add something real quick to this? Because we were talking about Reconstruction as a praxis, and like it's a practice, it's a philosophy, and it's iterative. And if you look at the 13th Amendment, I think this is a great example, because having that clause in there where like accept as punishment for a crime is an impediment today, but it shows that back then that was still progress. Like it was progress, but it wasn't finished. That wasn't like some document etched in stone that like as we wanted to continue reconstructing the society, we don't think about getting rid of that component. You know what I mean? As we progress, because before the 13th Amendment, enslavement was just the norm of half of America. And so it's a very real problem, but it shows that like the practice of Reconstruction is something that's supposed to continue. Where if there was a flaw that denied equality to a group of people, that was in there because we're human and we just didn't think about it. We made a mistake. Maybe somebody they were collaborating with was dishonest and had an ulterior motive and we weren't aware of it. We can go back and fix it. And I think the work of Daryl and what a lot of people are doing now is trying to fix that, which a Reconstructionist framework would be thinking of a new constitutional amendment that gives us further protections regarding our voting rights. Like that's a way that you would look at it in a Reconstructionist way. I'd also say as a philosopher who thinks about how to like implement this like intellectually and in practice, you have to have like kind of like galvanizing phrases that then like open the door up to practices that people can do, and then like a body of scholarship that people can go into when they want to do those deep dives. And so like Daryl's been saying, he recently said the idea of freedom with versus freedom from. I wrote about that last year, where I think America at the beginning would try to have a concept of freedom where you're free from something, like they were free from the British, which then allowed them to do whatever they wanted, which could include taking freedom from other people. Reconstruction was an era where they interpreted freedom as trying to be free with other people, trying to be free with Black people. And this is another way of looking at freedom. I think there's another great like philosophical slogan to think about. It's from Africa. It's Ubuntu, which is I am because we are. Like as Daryl was pointing out, America has been trying to narrow the we. And if you think of I am because we are, you then kind of realize that by narrowing the we, you're also narrowing yourself. And that's like a pretty profound problem. And then there's this French philosopher, Emmanuel Levinas, who has this idea of justice, where justice comes from encountering the other. And that's a consistent practice by encountering the other and learning about their lived experiences and things like that, things you aren't aware of. You then have to expand justice as that equitable expansion. It's not a thing where you are just in like a stagnant way. That is a practice, and that's a practice from encountering the other, which I think is really what Reconstruction in many ways is about. And so this makes Reconstruction and Reconstructionism something that's not along a racial divide, it's not a gender divide, it's an expansive conversation that also should include indigenous people in it. Like that justice is expansive as we are brave enough to continue to encounter the other and have fair, equitable, just conversations, relationships with those people.
Yes, it specifically relates to the reconstruction or re-entering of people who've been convicted of crimes. Obviously, no exception clause in the 13th Amendment, no Section 2 insurrection clause that allows felony disenfranchisement at a state-based level. And just thinking about that for a moment, y'all, I mean, I had the pleasure and the privilege to be able to visit Germany and Norway, part of a delegation of activists and folks who do policy work and legislators and correctional folks to go visit their prison systems. You don't have to reconstruct or reunite or re-enter anything that you never take away. They never take away their voting rights. They never have a diminution of citizenship, right? Even after they've committed a crime in either of those countries. And we got two state-based examples, Maine and Vermont, where people, when I went and did my fellowship at the Department of Justice, in the Obama administration, I met Patrick Leahy, and he said he would canvass in the Vermont prisons because those people never lost their voting rights. But what's particularly unique about Maine and Vermont, they're the whitest states in the Union. And the history of felony disenfranchisement and what we showed in our case, it did not exist until after the 15th Amendment. They weren't even worried about the voting rights so much of people who committed crimes until after the 15th Amendment in the Constitution in North Carolina. That's just the historical record. And I think that's probably pretty consistent across many, many Southern states. So we cannot ignore that original kind of racist rooting of why we even came up with this concept of civic death in the first place, right? Who were we trying to make civically dead? Not everybody, you know what I mean? Because we've obviously seen in two states in this union, they never adopted that particular practice. So that's what Reconstruction could look like, particularly for people who've been to prison and jail.
I want to maybe start to bring in some of the audience questions that might help broaden the conversation. This has been a fantastic dialogue so far, and it's 2:04. We technically have until 2:30, so we still have plenty of time to get a couple more questions in. And I appreciate everyone's participation and active engagement. We're getting a lot of questions in, so I just want to make sure we can weave some of those in. And I'll mention one that I think there are a couple that are speaking to this point. One question says, how do you maintain hope when so much hard work and progress continues to get rolled back by regressives, ignorance, racists, the list goes on? And I think this is somewhat connected to another question that is maybe gesturing at the question of bad faith among people who are within the system when you try to navigate the mechanisms that the system provides, such as an amendment process, right? The notion that There can be corruption, there can be bad actors, where even if you have the dialogue, even if you have the people elected, even if you bring forward people in a room and try to have a conversation that's engaging a Reconstructionist praxis, much like the Reconstruction era, maybe there needs to be other means taken. And I'm not going to make any suggestions, but I'm curious, what you all think about this. I mean, how do you maintain hope? You see things getting rolled back. There's certainly some people in our current administration who seem to express bad faith, perhaps, in some of their statements. And then what does this say about Reconstructionism as a methodology, to address some of these longstanding issues?
I'll go first. So it's a very important question regarding how do you keep hope, and I'll say recently I've had a fascinating relationship with this concept because my book came out in 2021, and NPR said it was one of the best books of the year, but I would get feedback from plenty of people that it was like kind of a tough read, or it was like a downer or something, because I gave a picture of America that wasn't as rosy as a lot of people wanted. But then Trump became president, and people who have recently picked up the book have fewer criticisms about the how America wasn't as rosy as they imagined, and they see the ideas at the end of the book as things that actually give them hope. Like the ideas at the end of the book are more along the lines of Reconstruction and all sorts of things like that. And so hope, frankly, sometimes can come from places or entities that you didn't think had the hope. It's more it can depend on how receptive are you to see it in this new iteration, in this new era, where my book 6 months ago, according to many people, was not a hopeful book. But right now it's very hopeful for a lot of people. And so I found that to be really interesting because I haven't changed and the work hasn't changed at all, but its capacity to emanate hope apparently has. I think that's very fascinating. So hope can come from some other place, but it also can come from your the capacity to see the different iterations of it. That hope could reside in something that you read 4 years ago that you now can pick up, and then the hope is in there, and the hope wasn't in it 4 years ago because the environment was different then. I'd also say at the same time, like I think it's if you have a clear philosophy of what good practices are that you do just all the time, you can kind of do good things without the need of an external hope source because I'm engaging in these good actions. Etienne and I have been collaborating on this for a long time. I think every time we interact with each other, we have a really cheerful disposition. It makes the conversation want to continue. That's a proper way to interact with people, where then, who knows, sometime down the road, that thing you've been collaborating on and chatting about becomes a thing that then gives you hope and gives other people hope. And so it's like there's kind of a two-pronged thing. It can come from plenty of different places, but you as a person can engage in ways that other people might describe as hopeful just by exuding and practicing good actions with other people and yourself. So it's a kind of it's a complicated answer, but I think that's the way to do it because you just have to keep on going each and every day, and then when the hope shows up, be capable of and receptive to seeing it.
I think I'm gonna echo Barrett's sentiments in a slightly different way. Miriam Kaba, someone who I read her work, describes hope as a discipline. In any discipline, you have to practice, right? Malcolm Gladwell says it takes 10,000 hours to be a master, right? So if I want to be hopeful, I got to practice being hopeful for 10,000 hours to be a master at being hopeful, right? I went through this organizing training, Black Organizing for Leadership and Dignity. They told us it took 6,000 repetitions to be a master at something. So you have to practice being hopeful in a hopeless world. And I think of my ancestors, right? I mean, people who I can call their names, Clymer and Bertha White, in Tuskegee, Alabama, growing up in the Jim Crow South, what was their hope anchored in? And if they can be hopeful, to make it where I can even be sitting in this chair today. I can practice that same kind of discipline. So hope is something that you have to practice in the face of adversity, like any other resistance. Some people go to the gym. First time you go to the gym and you get under that weight, it's really, really heavy. But when you start practicing more, you build up more strength, right? So we have to practice hope to be hopeful in a dying world.
Let me just add something on to what Daryl just said, because when people talk about hope, sometimes the idea is looking forward. But I will say, like, I found hope by looking backwards. Like Reconstruction and seeing these heroes from that era provide hope. One thing, like I have a young son, and the amount of times you interact with people that they question whether they want to have children because the world's so hopeless, do they want to bring a kid into this world? And I go, if black people didn't bring kids into like a dystopian world, there just wouldn't be black people in America anymore. And so like if people can be hopeful then and bring kids into like a horrible environment and teach them to be good people, to champion equality and be willing to reach across a racial divide to create good change, then like I have plenty of reasons to be hopeful. And just the fact that I can have this conversation when I know that there's no way my parents or my grandparents could have had this type of conversation, like that's hopeful. And so I think there's an opportunity to find hope in the past to give you the strength to create those diligent practices that Daryl's talking about.
I appreciate that. And there's an extent to which sort of the Black American tradition is one that's born of hope almost necessarily because of the original circumstances being so dire, they could do nothing but other than hope and continue to press forward. And so that is also therefore an important part of our American story and in our American culture. I think far too often we view Black American culture as something that's distinct and separate from American culture, but it is very much part and parcel of American culture, and in some ways one and the same. So just as violence and oppression and surveillance is a part of American culture, also hope and overcoming and advocacy and protest is also a part of our culture as well, and part of that ongoing dialectic that occurs in our country. I want to see if I can get in a couple other questions. So we mentioned it briefly before, but want to make sure we return to it in case there were some other thoughts because it's so relevant and timely. Someone asked whether anything we've discussed or Reconstructionism sort of ties into Trump's exploration of deporting imprisoned U.S. citizens to El Salvador or other foreign countries. I have a couple of thoughts, but I wanted to
Yeah,
curious if
I
you all had
think
something
one
of interest to
important
add here.
thing is to recognize what period that we're in. And we're not in a reconstruction period now, folks. We're in a regressive period. So, how that ties to Trump's agenda and behavior, think about other instances when America was in regressive periods. Japanese internment camps, right? That was a real regressive period where we were looking at the we and we were trying to make it really small and we were really suspicious of people who didn't look exactly the same. That playbook is just they don't make new plays. They just run the same playbook over again. And now they've identified a new enemy that is different from some people that they want to marginalize and isolate. And they're using the power of the government and the punitive arm of the state to do that. So that's how they relate. We're not in a reconstruction period now, but reconstructionism is still important as the orienting theme of where we want to go.
I I echo Daryl's sentiments 100%. Like that's why Reconstruction and Reconstructionism is so important because it helps you clarify the eras of the society where like I think without the policy clarity, Obama was a second attempt at having Reconstruction, but there wasn't a clearly articulated era, like agenda that happened in Reconstruction. There's variables that show, that distinguish the two, but like the spirit was the same, and you can see that the spirit of the backlash was the exact same. Like MAGA, that spirit of that is the same spirit as the Redeemers. And that has been the same struggle ever since. And so one way, and Daryl's used this terminology, which I really appreciate because I implemented it, and it's always nice to have these like chats where Reconstruction is you thinking of freedom as freedom with, where we're trying to think about being free with undocumented Americans, being free with these immigrants and people of different backgrounds and stuff. This regressive period that's happening right now is trying to be free from this myriad of people that they just say are the problem. And by removing them from society in some fashion, whether that's sending them to El Salvador, whether that's preventing them from exercising their right to vote, or that's all sorts of stuff, they're saying that freedom comes by extracting people from our society or marginalizing those people. Like this is the tension. It's about how we define and understand freedom. And this is what's happening. And so I also think if you look at a lot of the arguments that his administration makes for why they have the right to do such and such an endeavor, it comes from trying to negate or marginalize things that were instilled during Reconstruction, during the Civil Rights Movement, which is it's the same agenda over and over and over again. It's really like the culture war that they're talking about is one between being free with or free from people.
And I love that dichotomy, freedom from versus freedom with. I think it helps to give a different uh, explanation of this tension between liberty and equality. And again, the history, as you note, provides so many of those examples. I mean, before Reconstruction, you have the emergence of the American Colonization Society, which you both know about, and that is the effort to ship Black folks out the country because too many abolitionists, too many dissenting voices are beginning to call into question the status quo. And even Abraham Lincoln was down for the cause initially with the American Colonization Society, supporting creation of Liberia and other efforts to try to ship Black folks out the country. But that did not come to pass because African Americans were intent on embracing their rightful place as citizens. And as some mentioned in the comments, after Reconstruction, well, certainly during Reconstruction and immediately after, you see the rise of the Ku Klux Klan. Barrett, you and I have talked about before, carpetbaggers, scallywags. Let's kick those dissenting white folks out of the South. Like let's deport them from the South because they shouldn't be part of the we because they disagree with what we want down here. So white Northerners coming down South to try to implement the Reconstruction agenda are demonized as they're othered, and then we want to kick them out and deport them internally because they disagree with our ideology. But then certainly, as folks said in the comments, Chinese Exclusion Act, 1882, alien land laws, National Origins Act. These are all the precursors of what we see happening now, which is an ideology bent on freedom from, as Barrett said, not expanding the we the people, to allow a more equal union, right? The foundational principles of our country.
One thing, let me chime in real quick regarding the American Colonization Society. Like that happened before Reconstruction. America hadn't even thought of an idea of being free with people. And so when they went and made Liberia, they were like the white people, the white Americans who like oversaw it, and the African Americans who were there, they were instructed to create a freedom from society in Liberia, where they were there to be free from indigenous African people. And that created a cultural tension in Liberia that was ever present until the 80s. And so like this freedom from is not something that's like explicitly a racial division. You can find any group and say that I will be free in the absence of that group. And I think this is also playing out in the present, where like some person that you can look at and say, I don't see how they're an other. Nope, they're an other, and they're gone. Like that's what a freedom from allows. It really creates a gateway into just fascism and authoritarianism, to be frank. And so that's a very significant problem.
One thing I feel compelled to bring back and circling around back around to Abion Tourget. And during these different cyclical periods, the back and forth of freedom with and freedom from, I think it's important to point out that white people have always had a role in fighting for justice from the very beginning, right? It might have started with the most marginalized group, but then white folks and white allies and allies of other races have always been on the fight for justice. To me, that's hopeful as hell. That means all I got to do is tap into, you know what I mean, the historical legacy of the white people who I'm dealing with today. Because your historical legacy is not just oppression, it's not just attending lynchings. Your historical legend is the Abion Tourgés too, right? Is the Anne Bradens, is the Amos Ackerman, the first Attorney General of the Department of Justice that was created to protect the rights of Black people, a former white Confederate, almost prosecuted the Ku Klux Klan into dormancy, right, until their second revival. This is critically important. We have always fought together. This is nothing new, and we just have to remember that and fight together now.
I love that. That's so important to just remember. Part of the task is remembering the history, right? That is trying to be buried in silence, that this is not a fight. This is not an effort that is only being accomplished by people of color or immigrants, but there are white Americans as well, Americans that go back generations that have been part of this fight for justice as well, right? Even during the Reconstruction era, going all the way back to the founding of our country. Um, I want to return to maybe a final question that I have for you all to give you all a chance to sort of provide some concluding remarks, and then perhaps we'll have one more time after one more moment after that for a question from the audience if there's time. But both of you are engaged in work that not only resists injustice, but also reimagines the future. So in the spirit of Reconstruction, its aspirations, its radical policy proposals, its transformative vision, what ideas, strategies, or policies would you propose to help reconstruct the United States today into a more just, inclusive, and democratic society? And we can start with you, Daryl.
I'm gonna get super practical because I figure Barrett in his philosopher role will, address the meta. I'm gonna go down to the micro. Power. We have to build the power to change the Constitution. And to do that, we got to win 33 states. And 33 states has to call for a constitutional convention to change the Constitution. That's the organizing. That's the legal work. That's the policy work that we need to be working in service towards. That creates our new world. And then we can write in that Constitution a love Constitution, a Constitution based on empathy, a Constitution based on solidarity. We can write it however we want to, but first we got to build the power to get there.
Yeah, so I'll go. Yes, I'll do the philosophical perspective, but at a practical level, as a DC resident, I think of a policy thing that DC people should be thinking about is statehood. Like that is a reconstructive thing that would reconstruct the Senate to a certain extent, that would reconstruct the House. It's a fair thing that makes sense. That could be, that could be an amendment. I think thinking in the terms of amendments is really significant. Like that's really big picture, but that's how big they were thinking in Reconstruction. I think a lot of times we gotta get scared to think that big, where it's like it's impossible. We have to go the more practical, incremental steps. And I think the women's suffrage movement is an example where they tried that for a very long time, and until they committed themselves to thinking big about amendments and coming up with like slogans and language and agenda that could unify all these organizers around this movement, it didn't happen. And so I think we need to be thinking like that. I think another amendment straight up is something that further strengthens our voting rights. Right now, it's always articulated that they can't take it away via particular means. And so what that results, and come up with another way to make it difficult. I think there needs to be something that thinks about proactively protecting our voting rights. I think Canada, when it comes to their voting rights, they have this. They actually have this thing called Elections Canada that exists to ensure that people have the best access to voting possible in the nation. That's not a concept America thinks about. Like we're not thinking progressively. We're thinking about trying to prevent them from taking it away via various ways. And I think, Daryl mentioned Vermont. Like Vermont, if at state elections, you can vote if you're incarcerated. Like you can vote in the prisons. He just said like Patrick Leahy would campaign in the prisons. I think that voting rights should be extended to all the incarcerated at the federal level. Everyone should be able essentially like committing voter fraud or stuff like that would be things that could, take your voting right away. But I mean, even then, maybe it should probably only be temporary. But these are larger discussions. These are things we have to think about. And then if we're thinking about this at this big scale, we need to have like simple slogans and messaging and things like that that can galvanize the people. And so that's why stuff like freedom with, I think, can be like really helpful. Ubuntu, I am because we are, stuff like that to really motivate and energize these activists across the country, like Daryl, legal scholars, because there's a whole like constellation of things that you have to cultivate around like a philosophical vision to make this grandiose change. And until we start thinking like that, then we can't make the change that we want to make. And so that's kind of how I see it.
One final question. I think this has been a fantastic conversation, a lot of theory, a lot of analysis, a lot of practical suggestions. I think this one helps bring it down to earth for us. And the questioner apologizes for what they call a dumb question, but I don't think it's dumb at all. They ask, what do we teach the kids? Right? Does this come down to common sense, or is this something else? And I think this is a profound question, especially as we witness assaults on the university, assaults on educational settings, and questions about what is appropriate to discuss with kids, what is not, questions of making young people feel ashamed. And they are the future. They are the ones who will enter into the halls of Congress, into positions of leadership, both politically and in the private sector. How do we inspire our youth? What should we be telling them about addressing these issues and how to interpret the Reconstruction moment and its relevance for today? And let's allow this to be the final point, and then we'll end after this.
So I'll try to be quick. I've been thinking about this a lot. Like I mentioned, I have a young kid, and so I have to at some point be able to articulate this work to my son when he can ask these questions. And when I think of Reconstruction at like a really basic level, you could describe it as friendship, where like black people and white people were able to be friends, like real friends, where they could go to the same place together and be friends. And like friendship becomes this profound practice that actually like changes the society where you have, and you start thinking about like what makes a friend a good friend. And like a good friend is someone that you feel can sustain and nurture you. And like when we start talking about like common sense, I think that's something that we hope to have in America. But this is a side that's never wanted to have a common people. They've always wanted to have a divided group of people where the notion of common came from the group that created the division, that has the power to say that they are the common people and the other people are the other. That is a very violent, unfriendly way to live. And so we have to acknowledge that we don't have common sense in this country because we don't have common people. And if we want to change that, we have to really look at friendship as something that's quite transformative, where like being a friend to someone, just like how I'm friends with Daryl and Etienne, is a thing that you can do at a micro level. But if you think about it really hard, that can be a macro thing that influences policy and the shaping of the nation. And I think Reconstruction was also a bit of that. Like we have these examples of Frederick Douglass talking with Abraham Lincoln and his cabinet, and they became friends with him. And that influenced their policy of Reconstruction and understanding what they needed to do to extend rights to African Americans. Like that's just friendship. That's freedom with. And so like that's like the types of conversations we have to have with kids because at some point we're all going to have to figure out how to make friends. And if you can be a good one, and that can be a good one to someone that your society might have said was an other, well, then you can start changing the game at a pretty profound level.
I think it's good to end on that, Etienne.
Well, Barrett, if you don't mind, I might quote you in the future. We cannot have common sense until we have common people. I just want to thank our speakers for sharing your wisdom and insight today. This discussion explored not only the constitutional architecture of our society, but also historical memory, forgotten possibilities, as Daryl has shown us, that are embedded in the Reconstruction era. We've seen how the law can shape culture, how erasure can distort justice, and how history can point the way forward. As we close, I hope today's conversation inspires you to keep asking difficult questions. These are not easy questions, and we have to continue to talk it through, continue to engage it across the aisle. I ask you to remain engaged with our legal and cultural frameworks and to reimagine what justice can look like. Thank you all for being here. We're going to continue to have other scholars here in the future. And stay curious, stay critical, and continue the conversation beyond this space. Thank you so much for your